We continue our special coverage of the fatal daycare crash in Laval, Quebec. Recapping what we know, 2 children have died after a transit bus was driven into a daycare center. A man has been taken into custody facing homicide charges. Those who live nearby and those whose children go to that daycare are deeply shaken.
Everyone was panicking, crying, comprehension. Are the kids okay? Is my kid affected,
There's a mother that came in and she just fell on the floor crying. She was hysterical. And the policewoman, she tried to calm her down,
I thought the bus had just hit the kitchen. I didn't realize that there were children who were there. And when I went to the other side of the bus, that is when I saw that there were people who had been hit.
Here's an overhead view of the scene with the front of the bus wedged into the building. Police made sure that parents got to their kids right away. The mayor of Laval is giving families access to psychologists to help them. 6 children remain in hospital. This man, Pierre Ni Saint-Amand, is charged with homicide and dangerous driving. He was employed by Laval's transit system. Investigators will be questioning him about a motive. And of course, we're on the ground in Laval with comprehensive coverage. Erika Landry is a spokesperson with the Laval Police, and we'll get an update from her in just moments. But first, we'll go to the CBC's Alison Northcott, who's been on this story all day. And Alison, just tell us, what is the latest?
Well, we are a little bit closer to the daycare now than we were before. It's behind me and just around the corner. This happened around 8:30 this morning. Police say that a bus crashed right into the daycare. Witnesses say it's an area of the daycare where there were the oldest kids in the daycare. They're about 4 and 5 years old. And they described a really chaotic scene that they came across. We heard from one woman whose husband entered the daycare right after they heard the crash. And him and some others were able to hold down the driver, the bus driver, until police were able to arrest him. They described him acting erratically. They said he wasn't wearing any clothes. He was arrested, and he's facing charges of dangerous driving and homicide, and police are still trying to determine a motive. And as parents were called to the daycare, there was so much anguish and anxiety of parents arriving, looking for their children, trying to see if their children were okay. We know now that 2 children have died. 6 others were taken to hospitals, some near hospitals and others in Montreal. And police are continuing their investigation right now, which is involving the entire Laval Police Department. So it's an extensive investigation, and the impact of it in this community for neighbors who live near there, even if they didn't see it, it's just a tremendous amount of shock and disbelief here in Laval.
We also heard, Alison, from the hospital where some of the children were sent. What have they said?
Well, they were saying that they have, at this particular hospital in Montreal, which is a trauma center, a pediatric trauma center for children, they had 4 victims who were transported to that hospital, 2 boys and 2 girls. They said they're preschool age, so around 4 and 5 years old. They said that one of those children was in the ICU, the others were being evaluated, and that it was still early, that this is the next 24 hours they were going to be monitored closely, but all of them were dealing with different levels of trauma. So there's the physical, obviously, injuries that they've sustained, but they talked as well about the psychological trauma. That's something that they will be followed for a long time as well, not just right away, but into the coming weeks and months as well. So we haven't had another update from that hospital at the time, and so this is continuing the police investigation. And there's also psychological support for people in the community. There were some ministers in the government here earlier trying to coordinate a crisis center to where people could go and get psychological help. That would be for parents who are affected, for the parents at the daycare whose children are okay to have gone through something so horrible and been so close to a tragedy like that. Also for emergency workers, we heard a police officer saying he heard, he saw one of his officers in tears, and these are officers that encounter a lot of tragedies, but said they were particularly particularly touched by this because of the young age of the victims and the pain that comes with that. So a lot of psychological support as well will be offered to the daycare staff as they continue this investigation and as people try to come to terms with this and try to understand a motive and what may have been behind this.
And Alison, finally, you've been there all day. Can you just give us more of a sense of what it's been like there, how the community has reacted, what you've been able to see as you get closer to the actual daycare where this occurred?
Yeah, the police had kept a pretty wide perimeter around the daycare for most of the day, but just about an hour ago we were able to get a little bit closer. You can see we're still quite a ways away. Police here are keeping us at this line, but people are starting to bring flowers to the area to give you a sense of how touched neighbors are. A lot of people coming by, chatting with each other, just looking at the scene and being with other neighbors, people who weren't affected necessarily, people who live right near might have not have heard it themselves. I spoke with one neighbor who said she takes that bus every day and she couldn't help but wonder, you know, was that a bus driver she'd encountered before? Was it a bus driver whose bus she'd been on before? So these are the feelings of how close it is to the community, whether people are
And that was, we're obviously having a little bit of connection problems, but that was Alison Northcott live in Laval, Quebec. So let's turn now to Erika Landry. She's a spokesperson for the Laval Police, and she is on the scene. Erika Landry, thank you for speaking with us. Appreciate this. What can you tell us about the investigation right now?
Well, you guys all know that we have one male in custody, the 51-year-old driver of the STL. He's been charged with reckless driving and also homicide. For sure, he will be meeting the investigators when his health is good. We are still on scene. We still have our crime scene investigators on scene. Lots of investigators of different squads are there too. We have a perimeter still on, but as your colleague said, it's not as large as it was this morning, and it's still ongoing.
It's still ongoing. So at this point, your investigators have not spoken with the suspect. What more can you tell us about that and why that is?
The information that I have right now is that he will be meeting with the investigators when he's in a good state of mind to be met.
And what can you tell us about the suspect and what happened this morning?
The motives are still unknown. That's all part of the investigation. That's why that's important that we talk to him. But it's still unpreemptible, and still we don't understand. We don't know the motives.
You don't know the motive. What do you know about the circumstances of what happened? Can you just take us back to this morning about what you do know about what happened at that daycare?
Well, we received a 911 call at 8:30 this morning concerning a bus that had driven through a daycare here on Dufferin Street. And for sure there were a few kids that were hurt. 6 were driven to different hospitals in Laval and Montreal, but unfortunately we had two kids that died.
Do you know the ages of the 2 children who died or anything about them?
No, I do not have that information right now.
And what's the atmosphere like there? How's the community feeling?
I think everybody is in shock because it's a quiet place, it's a quiet neighborhood, and the daycare is at the end of the street, and people are starting to come and bring flowers. I think people will want to come together to come through this event.
We also have reports of one adult who is in hospital being treated for shock. This must be a very shocking moment for first responders, for police officers, but also for the people who work in this daycare. What's your sense of that?
Well, I don't know who the adult was or his relation to the event. For sure, for police officers and first responders, when it's about kids, when it's it's always shaken us.
And so what is the next stage in the investigation in terms of trying to speak to the suspect and to try and understand a potential motive?
That's all part of their investigation techniques. I can't say right now because it's not my domain, but try to know why this place was chosen by him, why the reason underneath everything.
Is it your understanding that this was deliberate, that this bus drove into this daycare deliberately?
I can't say for sure right now because they haven't spoken to him directly about that. But as soon as we have information, we'll be able to relay it.
Erica, we appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. Erica Landry is the spokesperson for the Laval Police, live in St. Rose. It is a day of work in Ottawa for members of Parliament, but for many, their thoughts are on the events in Laval. This afternoon, the House of Commons held a moment of silence.
I'll invite honourable members to rise.
MPs continued with question period after that moment of silence, but not before party leaders and other MPs offered their condolences to families in Laval. And the CBC's Karina Roman is following reaction to this story from Ottawa. She joins me live, and so Karina, you know, I mean, these moments just kind of take over, don't they? What are you hearing today in terms of a reaction to this just awful tragedy?
A lot of reaction on the Hill. Obviously, if this has shaken Canadians, it's shaken people who are political leaders as well. At first, you know, when the news first started coming out, the response was, you know, shock, obviously, thoughts and prayers. But then when the news that 2 of the children had died, you know, you really saw a shift in tone to one of, you know, quite shaken in terms of our political leaders. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, spoke earlier in the day about it, and then once the tragic news of the 2 deaths came out, he did stop again to talk with reporters before heading into question period. So have a listen to what he had to say.
Can't imagine what the families of the kids who were killed and indeed the ones who are seriously injured are going through right now after the bus crash in Laval. I know that there are no words for parents who've lost their children this way. All Canadians are grieving with them, and we'll do whatever we can to support them in their horrific pain through the coming days and months and years of grief.
Now, Marco Mendicino, the public safety minister, also stopped to talk to reporters about his thoughts. He wouldn't comment on whether this was a deliberate attack or not, or what he knew maybe about the investigation so far, talking about it being a very fluid situation. But he did have this to say.
Our immediate thoughts go to the families of the victims, to the other children who are in the class, and to the entire team who work at that daycare. One can only imagine just how shattering this is for them.
Now, for the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, the leader for the Conservatives, he put out a tweet, a heartfelt tweet expressing his condolences, but then he also made this tragedy his first question in question period today. Have a listen.
A bus hit a daycare full of children, and unfortunately, we are learning that 2 children were killed and others are injured. As a father, I can imagine the suffering of the families who've been affected, and we all offer our support and our prayers to those families.
Now, Conservative MP Gérard Deltel, who's also a Quebec MP, he spoke coming either in, I can't remember whether it was into or out of Conservative caucus this morning, clearly very shaken by the news. Have a listen.
Well, obviously, this is very concerning, and as a father, I'm very impressed by that, and it's a very tough time for everybody. All my thoughts and prayers are for them. Very tough to talk about that.
You know, one of the sentiments we do keep hearing is just how people are struggling to even find the words to describe, you know, their thoughts and feelings on this. That's certainly the sentiment that came from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh when he made a very brief statement heading into question period.
I want to take a moment to acknowledge the really horrific tragedy in Laval. I don't have the words to express how horrible it is. I just want to acknowledge the first responders and send my thoughts to the families of the victims.
Now, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, before question period are member statements, and he chose this opportunity to make a member statement about the tragedy in the House of Commons. But before going into that, into the House of Commons, he also spoke in the foyer about the tragedy and his thoughts and how much he was affected by it. Have a listen.
What the situation requires is a lot of compassion and empathy for the people of Laval and especially the families. There's nothing more precious in all of our hearts than our children.
Now, as you also played at the beginning, Andrew, there was also that moment of silence at the beginning of question period. You know, it's definitely a day where, you know, there's still the politics and they're doing their work that they do as MPs and leaders. But, you know, it's one of those days where they kind of put all the sniping and the politicking and the arguing aside, you know, as sort of people recognize, you know, sometimes what really matters.
Karina, thank you. The CBC's Karina Roman live in Ottawa.